Welcome to Crossing the Line, a special 12-part series of Kidsketch focusing on the interesting and culturally diverse San Diego-Tijuana region during the region's designation as the World Design Capital of 2024. Crossing the Line by Kidsketch introduces kids and adults to the benefits of sketching as a way of seeing, understanding, and appreciating the interesting world all around us. Crossing the Line welcomes a different guest sketcher each time, and today we welcome architect Alberto Carrillo of Amarillo Estudio, located in Tijuana, Mexico. Alberto, or Beto as he is known, will tell us about his interest in sketching, how sketching is integral in his work, and why he chose for us to sketch the Tijuana building Harina El Rosal, an 80-year-old flour mill whose products remain a staple in homes around the world even today. Also joining us is Tatiana Perez, a Senior Associate at the Urban Land Institute of San Diego, Tijuana, who is interviewing Beto to learn about his fascinating story. Let's welcome them both and join their interview already in progress. And for those of us whose Spanish is a little bit rusty, Tatiana will be translating Beto's responses to her questions.
It may be a broad question, but why do you sketch? Puede que sea una pregunta amplia, pero ¿por qué dibujas?
No recuerdo exactamente cuándo o por qué empecé a dibujar, pero sí sé que es algo que he hecho desde que soy niño. Ha sido una forma que encontré de relajarme y de concentrarme. Siempre he sido un poco ansioso y eso me calmaba y me ayudaba a entender muchas cosas o a simplemente relajarme. Em, Podría decir que, bueno, yo me acuerdo cuando era niño que quería como pensar o me preguntaban en la escuela qué es lo que quería estudiar. Porque yo decía, ok, quería ser veterinario y lo que me emocionaba era como dibujar mi clínica donde iba a suceder mi trabajo. Después, por decir, pensaba, cambiaba y decía, bueno, ahora quiero ser chef y me ponía a dibujar mi restaurante y diseñar los espacios y todo hasta que después como que caí en cuenta que lo que realmente me gustaba era ser eh, quien dibujaba los espacios para desarrollar el trabajo, ¿no? Diseñar mis cosas y después descubrí la carrera de arquitectura y me pareció como que era realmente lo que quería como a los 12 años y es realmente una forma como de llevar a la realidad los dibujos que desde siempre he hecho y es lo que me apasiona y me divierte mucho.
I don't really remember why or when I started drawing. It's something that I've always done. It helps me relax, concentrate, and understand some things around me. When I was a child, when I thought about what I wanted to be when I grew up, I thought, for example, of being a veterinarian, and I drew a clinic. Then sometimes I changed my mind and I thought about being a chef and I drew a restaurant. With time, I realized that what excited me was to design and think about the space I was going to work in. And that's how I discovered architecture. That was when I was about 12. And I realized that my drawings could come true. What advice do you have for someone just learning how to sketch? ¿Qué consejo le darías a alguien que está aprendiendo a dibujar?
Creo que podría decir que para aprender a dibujar o si estás iniciando a dibujar, tienes que ser muy observador con todo lo que está a tu alrededor eh, y analítico, porque creo que es la única forma de darle como sentido a lo que estás dibujando. Por decir, si quieres dibujar un árbol, como que muchas veces piensas como en un árbol, la imagen que tienes mental, pero en realidad no te pones a darte cuenta de cómo es que de un tronco va evolucionando, por decir, a pequeñas ramas o las ramas se van haciendo más delgadas o salen palitos hacia un sentido, hacia otro sentido y después se van transformando en hojas. Bueno, como son las hojas, son redonditas, son puntiagudas, hay muchas variedades de árbol en realidad. Creo que, por ejemplo, en el caso del árbol, es mucho estar observando en qué dirección crece, en qué formas irregulares toman, dependiendo de la variedad, que eso pues es prácticamente para todo. En este caso, para un árbol o para, no sé, un perro, o un auto, un edificio, como que tienes que saber bien cómo es que funcionan para, pues, para poderlos dibujar después, incluso sin estar viendo uno. Y que practiquen mucho también. Creo que gran parte del dibujo es practicar cada que puedan, si se puede diario mejor, y estar pues constantemente ejercitando los trazos, porque eso es lo que creo que en un 60% puede ayudarte mucho.
I would recommend being very observant and analytical. In my case, that's what helps my drawings work. For example, when you're going to draw a plant or a tree, I would recommend being very observant and analytical. In my case, that's what helps my drawings work. For example, when you're going to draw a plant or a tree, study it. Look at the trunk and how it transforms into smaller trunks, then thinner branches with irregular shapes and irregular leaves that are rounded, pointed, elongated, or any kind of shape. That's why I recommend analyzing the objects you want to draw and copying them as best as you can so you can understand them and then draw them out of memory. I just recommend practicing a lot. Whenever you have the opportunity to draw, take it. Why did you choose this building? Escogiste un edificio interesante. ¿Por qué escogiste este edificio?
Este edificio siempre me ha llamado la atención desde que soy niño. Cuando me pidieron elegir un edificio de Tijuana, quise escoger un edificio que no fuera como famoso fuera de Tijuana, pero que sí representara algo para la ciudad o para los tijuanenses. Y después de varias opciones de edificios, me acordé de este edificio que siempre me ha causado como mucha intriga y que aparte me gusta mucho cómo quedó metido dentro de la trama urbana de la ciudad. Como que siento que es así como un monumento a la Tijuana antigua o cómo creció eh, como ciudad industrial. Me parece un paisaje muy único. Además, cuando me puse a investigar respecto a los diferentes edificios que pudiera elegir, este me gustó también porque como que trae muy buenos recuerdos de generaciones más grandes, como de generación de mis papás o incluso de mis abuelos. Eh, Se trata del edificio de la Harina El Rosal, que es conocido bajo ese nombre, pero en realidad es un silo, no es la fábrica en sí, ahí es donde guardan el grano. Este edificio es propiedad de una empresa que se dedica a hacer galletas y pastas y la gente lo tiene con muy buenos recuerdos porque, sobre todo la generación de los 50 o los 70, cuando producían las galletas que no salían tan bien para la venta al público, las regalaban o las vendían muy baratas y los papás llevaban a sus niños afuera de la fábrica a comprarlas o a comer galletas y esto trae muy buenos recuerdos en la población, sobre todo de esas edades. También este edificio es de 1939, lo cual lo convierte en uno de los edificios en pie más antiguos que tiene Tijuana y ha sido desde siempre, ha tenido la misma función, ha sido un silo y sigue funcionando hasta el día de hoy y de hecho, según los vecinos, todavía huele a galletas por la noche.
Why did you choose this building? The building has always caught my attention since I was a child. When I was asked to choose a building for this exercise, I wanted to choose something that, although is not as recognized outside of the city, it is a building with which people from Tijuana feel identified. After exploring several options, I decided on this building since it intrigues me and I really like how the building, in a way, is trapped in the urban fabric. It's like a reminder that Tijuana is an industrial city. Also, while investigating, I realized that people have very good memories and a certain attachment to this building, Harina El Rosal, which is also a silo where wheat grains are stored. The building is owned by a company that manufactures and sells pasta and cookies. People from the 50s and 70s remember this building with great affection. They say that at certain times the company would give away or sell very cheap, freshly made cookies that were outside the quality standard. This is a very happy memory for a big part of the community. The building has existed since 1939 and is one of the oldest buildings in the city still standing. For some years, it was the tallest building in Tijuana and has always had the same function. Even today, it remains in operation, and according to the neighbors, it always smells like cookies at night.
Before we begin sketching this wonderful old building, we thank Beto for his selection and recollections of this silo, and to Tatiana for her insightful questions and translations. And now we can get to know this building a bit better because, as Beto said, what better way to understand something than to sketch it? Let's start our sketch by blocking out the building. You'll notice that it's a series of rectangles. Here's a wide rectangle. There's a skinny, a short, wide rectangle sitting on top. And to the right is this rectangular tower, taller than the other building down below. We're going to start with this one, with the one that has the silos in it, these round shapes. These round shapes, these shapes that are like cylinders. Those are the silos, and those are what hold the grain. I like to start figuring out proportions. I'm going to notice that the width of this rectangle that has the silos in it, compared to its height, the width is about 2 times the height. So if we come to our sheet, and start in the middle, let's make a rectangle. And actually, when I need to make a rectangle that's 2 times the height, I'm going to start by making 2 squares. Because visually I can see what a square is. The width is equal to the height. And I'll do that twice. And there are my 2 squares. I'd like to do a couple of things. I tend to hold my pencil pretty loose in the early stages, and I'm starting in pencil. And I don't choke up on it, and I keep my lines a little bit light. Staying with the silos, let's take each of these squares and divide them vertically in half. And now you have 4 tall rectangles. Now take each of those rectangles and divide them in half again. And now you have 8 tall, skinny rectangles. And there are our silos. Except if you're paying attention, you're going to notice there are 9 silos. Okay, let's just add one. I'm adding one to the left. Now let's put this little rectangle up on top, this horizontal rectangle. Notice that the left-hand side of that rectangle starts about halfway through this outer silo. And the height of that little blue band, it's a little skinnier than the width of one of these silos. You're going to see me keep coming back to the width of a silo, almost as a measuring device. So I'm going to come up, I'm going to make that rectangle, horizontal rectangle. There's that part. And now the tall tower, there's a horizontal line that goes through that tall tower that aligns with top of the silos, bottom of that blue rectangle. So I just made a hint of a line there. Remember I said I'm going to use the silos as a measuring device. Well, it looks like the overall width of the whole tower is equal to 3.5 silos. That front face of the tower that's in the shadow, it's about 2.5 silos. So come over and make the face of that tower, the part that's in the shadow, about 2.5 silo widths. And then the part that's in the sun, it's about 1.5. These are approximate. You don't have to be exact. This is a sketch. Keep it loose. Lock it in. Erase it if you're not comfortable with it. But that's the building, and we've kind of blocked it out. Let's add a few more things for our composition. One is, let's make these 3 silos on the right just a little longer at the bottom, and then line the tower up with it. Okay, now we're going to start it. I'm doing that because this building in the foreground is kind of in the way. The next step after blocking out the building, before we add some of the details, is I'd like to give our sketch some boundaries because I'd like to focus on the building. I don't want to spend all my time doing too much of the entourage, if you will, the urban setting. So I'm coming down a little bit, 3 silos, 4 silos thick. I'm coming down and creating a bottom. And then off to the right-hand side, I'm making a vertical edge. The top, I'm going to make it wherever I want because there's not going to be that much of the sky in there. On the left-hand side, wherever you'd like to put that left-hand border. Again, keeping your sketch small. The larger your sketch, the more time you're going to spend doing it. You'll be filling things in, and I usually like to sketch kind of fast and quick. The next one is let's block out the mountain range behind. You'll see that it's starting on the left of the tower, about halfway up. It goes up and down, and it's a layering. So if you were to make a couple of wavy lines to indicate the hill, there's actually another hill, speaking of layering, that starts about most of the way up the height of those silos. So go ahead and make some wavy lines there. That we see the mountains on the right of the tower as well. And we see that hill over there on the right. So now we have the background. You can make a couple of other lines on the left. As you see, there's trees, there's buildings, there's urban fabric back there. And we're working our way out to the front. So the front foreground is a mixture of a bunch of rectangles, some blobs that are trees, some signs, and if anything, it's all a lot of very horizontal rectangles. So just start blocking out some rectangles. You can be specific on this building if you want to or not. It's got a little curve to it, but we want our building, our silos, to be the most interesting thing. So I'm just going to make, I said, some blobs that are trees and some rectangles that are buildings. There's a palm tree in here. There's a HSBC sign, some cell tower like thing. You see some street lights. This big billboard that we get to design some advertising for, because I'm not going to encourage us to try to sell Bud Light in our sketch. Okay, so just a few more rectangles, very nondescript. The less specific, the better, because then our eye won't go to that area. We want our eye to go to the building. All right, we have our whole sketch sort of blocked out. Let's start to add some of the details. There's a lot of rectangular openings in that horizontal band, that blue band above the silos, and a lot of square and rectangular openings in the tower. Let's start with those. We don't need to be very specific, but they give it a lot of the building character. Let's make 2 horizontal lines, very light lines, in the middle of this blue rectangle. Just like that. Notice that the windows, there's a window that's right above where 2 silos come together, approximately. So go ahead and make a small square, they're kind of rectangular, right above that joint where 2 silos come together. Keep them small because the openings are small and we want them to be understated. We don't want them to have too much importance. And we'll ink those in. And you'll notice that there's a couple of doors up there. You can add those, just count what window they're closest to. There, I've lightly blocked out those little window openings. There's a dark line at the top of that blue rectangle that I'm going to add, there's also a second line at the top of the silos that I hadn't blocked out. I think now, while we're here, let's add Harina El Rosal, the signage up there. Again, I'm going to use what I've already done to give me an idea of how big the letters are. El Rosal, the height of those letters looks like they're not quite as tall as the blue band. So I'll go up just a little. Not quite as tall. Notice that the E is lined up just about center of that center silo. That's a good place to put the E. The R is lined up sort of aligned with that third silo on the right. So that can give you a little bit of help. Again, whatever is already there that you've sketched helps you position your letters. Notice that the L is lined up between that first and second one. I feel like I have my letters a little tall, so don't know how yours are looking. And if I need to, you could always make the tower taller. Harina is a little more than half of the E. So it's smaller. The A is pretty much lined up in between the fourth and fifth tower silo. The H is just to the left of that second, third one. I mean, you don't have to do it the way that I'm doing it, which is putting the outer letters. You can just start on one side, but that's a good way to space them. But I think that works pretty well. How do your letters look? Okay, now let's do the windows on the tower. There are dark bands on the left, on all the corners of the towers. You could add those. As I'd mentioned, you can check the height. I'm checking the height of mine. I'm making my tower just a little taller. So let's start in the upper portion of this front-facing portion of the tower, the left-hand side of the tower that's in the shadow. I'm going to make 2 vertical lines that are pretty close together in that upper portion. And then I'm just going to block out these little squares. Starting with that bottom window first, the top of it is just a little bit above those openings in that blue band. And then I'm just going to drop them in. There's 4 of them. They're not evenly spaced. There's one pretty close to the top. Let's do the windows to the right of that side. So making 2 making 2 lines close together near that right edge. They're a little farther apart than the ones on the left. Notice that these 3 upper windows are narrower than all of these openings down below. So, but they do line up with the ones that you just did. Block them out, lining them up with the ones that you already did. Wherever you put them, just line them up. And then that 4th one is a square, big chunky square. I don't know what those are. They could be openings for service to get into the silos. I don't actually know what happens in the building. Okay, now sticking with this left-hand side of the tower, let's do these 5 openings in the lower part. Notice that they're not evenly spaced. 2 are evenly spaced, 3 are evenly spaced. So what I'd like to do is I'm just going to make a light horizontal line about halfway down in this lower tower portion. In the upper of these 2 spaces, I'm going to make 2 squares. They're sort of evenly spaced like that. In the lower portion of the tower, there's 3 openings, and they're sort of squeezed together, but they're equally spaced. Like that. Do yours look like that? Sure, they're fine, whatever you made them look like. All right, now let's go to the sunny side. The window openings line up with what we've already done, but they're gonna be, because this side of the building is at an angle, they're pretty close together. So I want you to make 2 pairs of those vertical lines very close together, and then just wherever your windows were on the front facing, trace them over to the side. And they shouldn't actually look square, they should look vertical. Again, because we're seeing that side at a bit of an angle. And then the lower portion of the tower, their windows, there's no big openings. So the tops align. There. And we don't see too many because the billboard is hiding some. Okay, now we've blocked out the tower. Maybe while we're still at the tower, you can sort of see up at the top there's some thin railing. And there's something, I don't know if it's a cell tower, there's like some antenna thing. Don't know what that is. I'm just gonna block it out. Looks like a lifeguard station. Little something up there. All right, we've got the building blocked out. Before we move to inking, there's a little bit more I'd like to do while we still have the pencil in hand, and that has to do with the shadows on these silos. Right now, there are a series, we've sketched out 9 tall, skinny rectangles, and in some photos, they look like tall, skinny rectangles. It's when the sun is shining on them and there's a shadow that we can see they're circular. They look like cylinders. Let me do a little demonstration. I've made our 9 towers a little bigger for this demonstration. It's like I said, it's the shadows that cause these buildings to turn. When you have a curved form like this, and the sun is coming from the right-hand side, as in the case of our photo, the right-hand side of each of these is going to be in the sun. So what we would do is to make, I'm gonna just start, if we would just make the left-hand side of each of these towers, silos, have a little shadow on them. And can you see just with these simple forms, they're already starting to turn a little bit. And I'm keeping my lines light. But there's a couple other, there's like 3 other things that are going to tell us that they're also turning. There is some sort of a walkway up top here, and it's casting a shadow. You can sort of see there's a curved line up here, like that. It shows up on each of them. If your sketch is really small, you probably wouldn't bother with much more than adding a couple lines to the left of each of the silos to show that there's a bit of a shadow over there. And see how that helps turn them. But let's go back to these vertical shadows because there is a dark line between each one. And I'm making each of these lines. It helps it punch. But the interesting thing about shadows on a curved form is that the darkest point, and it's going to be lightest in the middle where the sun is just starting, uh, where the shadow is just starting, it's going to get darker. And then when you get over here to this edge, it starts to lighten up again. And the reason that at the very far left side of these silos it lightens up again is because the light is bouncing around. You see how convincing that starts to look when I don't take that dark shadow all the way to the edge? There's one other thing. There's another shadow that I'm going to show, and that is that each of these silos, with the exception of the first one, each of these silos has a shadow cast on it from the silo to its right. Do you see this strong diagonal line? That may have been the first shadow you noticed. You might not have noticed the subtle shadows over on the left-hand side of each silo. There's that pronounced line, and that is because this silo casting a shadow on this guy, this silo casting a shadow on that side. So the next thing, the next shadow that we're going to do is going to be a diagonal line like this. It's actually just like a triangle right here. And that's the part you're going to keep absolutely no lines in, like a little wedge. And then you'll come down here and finish your shadows. Okay, here's the interesting thing. If you squint, the darkest shadow on these of all is in this little area here. And you'll notice as I'm darkening this area, look how this little light side really lightens up. And then we're going to go through. It's kind of important not to let any of these diagonal lines show through. Now there's only so much, once we switch to pen, there's only so much finesse that you can give it. When you're working in pencil, you can really get a lot of things to change, a lot of finesse in there. Mostly what I'm doing this for is to show the concept. Again, in our tiny sketch, we're not going to get this much definition in there. It's just, I wanted to show you how shadows work, how cylinders work, how to get a convincing curved form. If you want to not worry about shadows like this, then just pretend it's a cloudy day and you won't get those shadows. I'm trying to keep all my, because these are vertical forms, I'm trying to keep all my shadow lines vertical. Now that we have an understanding of the concepts behind shading these silos, let's add in pencil, let's block out some of the shadows. Remember, the sketch is small, so we're not going to get too detailed, not like in the demonstration. A couple of lines on the right-hand side, a couple of lines on the left-hand side of each of your silos, but not all the way to the edge. See how I'm keeping these lines away from that far left edge? Then a darker line where the silo abuts its neighbor. Like that. The far left one doesn't have that dark line. And then if you want to make this little bit of a curve up top, keep your pencil line light. And just make that little arc there. All right, and then remember the tower is casting a shadow on the first silo, but it's a couple of straight lines like that. For the rest of them, it's a little angle. And then add a few lines, and it's an angle. It's kind of got a curve to it, doesn't it, each of those? It's very subtle. There. Your shadows will be like that. We're ready to start inking, and I like to use a small point pen, Precise V7. And we're going to retrace our steps, starting with the rectangle in the middle, and then just following the lines. But also we're going to follow how we started, in that we're going to do the lines and shapes, and then we'll start adding some detail, and last we'll get to shade and shadow. So those shadows we spent so much time talking about, we'll do those near the end as well. So starting where at the beginning with the rectangle. And just making my lines, I don't make them too solid. I am going to go ahead and do each of these, do the lines in between the silos. See how I'm just breaking up the lines. And that's just because when you're working in ink, once you commit, you commit. So there might be some times when I don't want it as dark a line as you might get if you push really hard. And then the rectangle above it, where that little band of windows or openings are. And remember, we saw there's a dark line at the very top of that space. And there was also that ledge, I guess, up top of the silos. If you wanted to, there's a little railing. If you can sort of flick your pen, keep a really thin line, you can give some hints at the railing. But those little windows, again, you could color these in, darken them in black right now. But if we're blocking out doing lines and shapes and saving shade and shadow for the end, saving shade and shadow for the very end, then to be consistent, we would darken those in later. I'm going to do the tower next. But I'm doing the double lines at the corners. I know there's a lot of lines in here, so I'm starting with the corner, the edge of the building, just because it's a little confusing with all the lines I have. I don't know how your sketch came out if you had that many lines in there. the way I had. I'm going to block out the billboard as well because it's in front of the edge of that building, so I need to know where it is. Okay, and then the top of the building, again, there's making a double line in there just because it's dark up there. And then there is this dark band that goes around the middle of that tower that divided it. Remember, we had all the windows above and then we had the 5 below. And so I'm just going to start putting in these openings. You'll notice, I don't know if you'll notice, you're probably concentrating on your sketching, but I do tend to sort of flick my pen a little bit. If you slowly drag it, you'll get a thicker line like that, and that's fine. It's just, again, in ink, we, if you're with ink on some paper and with some pens, the longer your pen sits there, the more it'll sort of bleed into the paper. So the longer your pen makes contact with the paper, the more ink it will be there, is basically saying the same thing. And you may want that. On the other hand, you may not. So just keep in mind that the speed at which you make your lines is going to have an impact on how the ink hits the page. There, I think I've got all the little windows in there. Maybe there's the railings up on top here too. And again, if you can just lightly get your pen to get some flicks of railing, and then there's some sort of a tower, and then whatever this funny thing was, I think a little research should be good, but it's up there. There's some other things up there. Okay, now moving back over, we can add the letters. You can do these however you'd like. Keep the lines thin or make them a little darker. I think the verticals are thicker, the horizontals are thinner. If you've done a pretty good job with your pencil sketch, this part is fairly easy. There we go. And we'll leave the shadows until last, as I'd said. Let's do the backdrop, those mountains. It's just a series of lines, and they can overlap like that. Kind of cool how we see them in that atmospheric effect. The atmospheric effect makes this all sort of cloudy and hazy, and so it'll be lighter, softer, not nearly as defined. There's a layering effect here on the side of sort of a hill. There's some indication that there's a little bit of slope, so if you wanted to add that there. Now that we're on the side, it makes me want to put my border in so that I don't go too far over there. And the border at the bottom. If you blocked out in pencil certain areas and decide you don't want to do those, you can always take your pen and redefine your borders. Make them smaller, make them larger. I was pretty happy with the border I picked on this for the first time. Then I'm going to do a little edge treatment here. I see some cool rectangular shapes. It's a really big billboard and some buildings, but let me first define what's happening down here. I'm gonna make a tree in the corner that's up against this building. There's this rectangular form. I think that palm tree is behind. But because we're not doing that much definition, you get to make your rectangles however you want to make them. It's not meant to be clearly defined anyway. And then if once you get the edge of that building, if you want to add a little more tree, there's this palm tree. I remember Beto telling us that you have to look at shapes and study them. The palm tree is going to be different shape than a deciduous tree with leaves. I'm tempted. What do you think? That little fun power pole. The things that suggest it's an urban setting are kind of fun to add. And then just more rectangles. Oops, kind of went over. There's the HSBC sign. And you don't want to, I'm playing with some of these letters, but it's just a hint. If you put too much detail down here, then the eye goes there. You'll find that wherever you put most of your detail, that's where your eye goes. And so we have a little bit of control over what the viewer sees and looks at in our sketches. So see how I'm keeping them loose and sketchy and messy and not well defined. And I mentioned we wanted to give the billboard a different message than the one that's on there. Thanks, Bud Light, but no thanks. You see a little angle and some roofs. When you're sketching on location, things like sounds, you might, when you're sketching on location, doing vacation sketching or sketching outside, when you look at your sketch years later, there's certain things that might come back to you. For instance, maybe it was a warm day and you'll remember that doing that sketch and how warm it was. You might remember back what the sounds were. Was there a band playing? Was there a siren going by? You probably heard in my background. Were there smells and aromas, or the flowers blooming, or as Beto said, he sees this building and he's reminded of certain smells, the cookies baking, which are really really nice memories. I mentioned on the left-hand side I was going to add that billboard. So just keep adding whatever little blocked out rectangles you want to. All right. I think that's a nice amount of detail. Oh, I'm going to say crossing the line. I'm going to use my pencil and I'm going to write the words. Crossing the line. And then I'm going to write Tijuana for fun. And I'm just going to make some little sort of scratch marks to hint at the letters. Because as I've said, if I make them too detailed, your eye will go there. So it's just a hint. Billboards have especially these big ones, they have a lot of things underneath them. Okay. So we spent a lot of time putting pencil in the shadows, but because our sketch is so much smaller and because we don't want to commit too much ink to an area that is grays, they're not darks. They're not our darkest darks, well, except the seam in there that we've already done. And so I'm going to recommend that um, we try it this way. Let's start with the one on the right. I'm going to suggest that make just a couple of vertical lines on the far left of your first silo, but remember, leave the farthest left area open. So I'm making it like that. And then I'm going to make a couple of little short lines that's indicating that shadow at the top. So now I've got these little vertical lines. Try to get your pen to skip. I'd make maybe 3 of them like that. All right, let's go back to this one and then I'm trying to be careful not to do a really pronounced diagonal line. So I'm going to do any of those diagonal lines as a series of dots. Your darkest part of your shadow is going to be right there between the 2 silos. And then I'm just going to do a series of vertical lines. So I'd recommend doing it like this and going all the way across to do all the silos to the same degree, and then decide if you want to go back and add any more. So find your angle, define it with a series of dots, make some vertical lines. You can have more lines close together where you're closest to the 2 silos coming together. You have to trust the process on this one because you're thinking, it doesn't look right, or oh my gosh, what am I doing? Trust the process. Wait until it's done. Don't panic if you get too much ink in there. I will confess that shadows intimidate me, and so a lot of times I'll do just plain old line drawings without actually committing to shadows. But it really is the shadows that make your sketch that much more convincing. You notice I'm concentrating on the angled shadows, but I'm going to come back in and do those 3 little lines on the left-hand side of each of our silos. It's like me to go back and forth. I don't necessarily sketch. As you can see, it's not like I do left to right and complete everything as I go. You're building up your sketch. You put the things in that you need to put in first. And if you don't have any more time or, oops, don't forget, I almost did it. I almost put that curved shadow on that first silo. That first silo doesn't have a shadow from its neighbor silo because it's the tower that's casting the shadow. So stop right there, do a couple of vertical lines, and then all it gets is the little curving shadows up top and those couple of lines just to indicate that the silo is turning. There we go. So now I'm circling back. I'm adding a few lines to indicate that it's a curved form. The little shadows on top. It's the overall effect. If you study the silos too closely, they might not look quite right, or you might not be satisfied. But squint your eyes and see the impact is coming through. Or pick up your sketch and hold it farther away and see what I mean. It'll read. Okay. I think mine have really turned. How about yours? And and maybe stop, don't keep working on it, and wait until you're done with the whole sketch and see if you need to add anything. Okay, now we're gonna go ahead and add some of those tonal values. I'm going to darken in the windows. And what you can also do that makes it look sort of sketchy is maybe sketch in, darken in the top and the right and leave a little light, especially because there's a little light shining through some of these. And then it just adds some character. If we zoomed in, I think there's some horizontal patterns on these big doors. They might be roll-up doors for loading and unloading. So if you wanted to darken them in by just making some lines like that, you could. But also give it upper right a little more punch. A little more dark. And then periodically step back and see how your sketch looks, or again, squint and see how your sketch looks. After the ink dries here, I think I'm going to take the eraser and get rid of some of these pencil lines. I want to see what have I forgotten and what do I need to add. So I'm going to lightly take up an eraser. If you have a kneaded eraser, that's good. I've got a big white eraser here. You want to definitely not start erasing over an inked area that you just finished. So I'm going to give the tower a minute to dry. You can also use the eraser at the back of your pencil. Maybe erase some of the lines from your little urban scene. I think it's fun to erase the pencil marks and see the character of the sketch come out. Okay, then the next thing, you could call it a day, but what I want to do, I want to add the shadow on the face of the building, the shadow on this section up here, and what that's going to do is it allows the sides where the light is hitting it to really stand out. To do the shadows on the face of this building on this left side here is I'm doing a series of just diagonal lines, and they don't have to be perfectly evenly spaced. And I'm trying to do it all at one time, and I'm also trying to make them sort of fast. And I'm shading it in. And I'm doing the same for that blue horizontal band up there where the doors and windows are. They're a little easier because the lines aren't quite so long. And I like to make mine at an angle like this, but you could make them vertical. It's a little darker next to the tower, so maybe come back and do a few more lines right in there and then let them sort of thin out as you go to the left. See how that really reads? And the next thing we want to do is to start adding foreground and background shaded in. I'm not going to do much to the mountains in the background. Maybe a few, just trace over a few of those curving lines that we added in pencil. But what I really want to do is I want to add some definition for what's happening. It's almost like I'm going to silhouette the building. I want some dark around the edges so that the building will pop. And like here where this tree is dark, Again, this is another trust the process. Let's do some shading over this building in the foreground. And I'm gonna let it sort of fade out a little bit. I'm gonna do a slightly darker rectangle here. You can see that I'm not really being true to what I'm seeing down here. I block some things out, I'm shading some in, I'm not shading others in. I'm doing it with a different series of lines. I made one rectangle really dark when I probably could have left it undone because it's on the side that's full sun. Then the areas down here, I'm gonna just shade them all in really dark. Okay, so I don't want to go overboard on how much of this I'm putting in. I do want to give some indication of a base over here, so a few of these things are going to get some tones like that. The tree, palm tree, I'm gonna make dark. That'll be in our foreground. Things over here in the foreground, I want to make a series, some light, some dark. Our sign, I want to keep that light. The sun is hitting it or light's bouncing around. So I'll make everything around it a little darker. Okay, we're almost done. And if we were actually there, we might be making this look sort of like the street that it is. But from this photo, we can't really tell it's a street. Up to you if you make this dark, that billboard. The sun is not shining on it. And I do want to do some indication back on this hill so that both the building and the billboard kind of punch. So I'm just doing a series of little squiggly horizontal lines. Indicates the terrain. I do see some sort of a tower up there. And then this last little stuff here is part of the urban fabric. So I guess on these sloping roofs over here, I'm not adding any tones on things that are roofs. I'm doing those areas where I see some walls. And that's what you're doing, is maybe the verticals that are in shadow are the ones that you're hitting with the pen and the ink. It's hard to describe how to sketch something that's just ambiguous. So however you want to sketch them. Okay. I'm gonna call mine done. I'm squinting. It seems to have a good enough punch. I can keep fiddling with it, but at a certain point, if it loses its charm if you do too much. I'm being careful not to judge. All right. Where are we? We are at the Harina El Rosal, flour mills, silos. I'll just leave it at the name of the building. We are in Tijuana, and add the date. Great.
How did you do?